Elon Musk, $54 billion to buy Twitter. Is that a good idea, David?
Which bit of it? Paying that much for it? Or it's, we are in such a mess about all this, aren't we? And it was all, I suppose, so predictable. When I first went on Twitter, it was largely a place where you did jokes and stuff like that, and you kind of had nice little sequences about films in which you took out the one word and put in another or something like that, and people did that. And then it became, for me, a really useful journalistic tool. Once you'd filtered out all the abuse, which gradually became greater and greater, and the disinformation, filter all that, use it as a really good tool. So I use Twitter a lot for a variety of purposes. Most of them, I would say, kind of pretty positive, although I can get a bit snarky from time to time. But it is a very, very, very powerful tool. And I suppose Timothy Garton-Ash, the writer, had a very good thread about this actually on Twitter earlier, where he said, essentially, some of Musk's ideas are quite good, like making the algorithms behind Twitter completely transparent. That's not a bad idea. But essentially what he said is, here's one chat takes over of his own whim an entire international platform for communication without any kind of, without any proper discussion with it, without any kind of debate or anything like that. It just happens, and then we take what he gives us. The secondary question, of course, is what he actually intends to do with it, which is the second part of your kind of good. It's a bad idea in the sense of it's not really particularly democratic or accountable. Is it a bad idea in terms of what Elon Musk will do with it? And that goes to the heart of a really big problem that we are absolutely unable to solve. What does he mean by free speech absolutism? Does he mean by it that, for example, child pornographers or just people who want to tell you how much they lust after children should be free to speak? If he doesn't mean that, then where is he drawing the line? And why is he drawing the line where he is? And by the way, that's not just his problem. That's our problem with almost all discussion of things like online harms.
Danny.
Exactly. I mean, David, you're quite right. And this whole thing about, cancel culture and freedom of speech runs into the immediate problem you've just raised. What do we do about child pornography? What do you do about direct racist insults or the famous shouting fire in a crowded cinema or direct threat to somebody's life? We don't regard all speech legally as being acceptable, or we don't allow all of it, and we also don't, as a private organisations, they're under no responsibility to carry things that they think will make society worse. They have to make judgments, and what's more, they will make judgments. Because I think that an idea that he's going to allow absolutely everything, he just will find that he won't do that. So the question is merely one of proportion, where you draw the line. If he was to say, I think Twitter has gone too far in censoring people's opinions and we ought to tilt it back, well, that would be, I think, a more coherent point than free speech absolutism. He's also got to do something, he's paid $54 billion. He's got to service the debt on Twitter, and he's therefore got to make some money out of it. And then the question is, who's going to advertise against the content on Twitter? And he's got to make a decision about the demographics of Twitter, because the demographics of Twitter lean towards middle class and upper middle class people, and city dwellers, and have those kind of values. Will they stay on Twitter? Will they want to engage in Twitter? Will they buy goods promoted on Twitter if Twitter is promoting a lot of things that they find deeply offensive? So there's a commercial decision there. So I think this kind of top line that he's got, which is I'm a free speech absolutist, will not survive his encounter with actually being in charge.
There is this interesting question, isn't there, David? The Donald Trump question. Why is Donald Trump not on Twitter, but other world leaders are on Twitter? Actually, you can find most of the Taliban and ISIS on Twitter if you go looking for it. But the defence was always, well, it's up to Twitter. It's their thing. They can pick and choose. But it's the point at which what was just a thing a private company running doing a thing, and they can pick and choose. It's now so ingrained. It's one of those things. It's gone from a platform to utility almost, isn't it?
This was a point of distinction between me and Danny and me and Hugo Rifkin from quite early on, really, although I never really totally resolved it. And I don't think any of us did, which was when you have a platform that is this big, the idea that they simply kind of make their own little rules to suit themselves, and that if they don't like a whole lot of people, then they'll cast them out, is actually problematic, because it means those people, whether you like it or not, are effectively prevented from having their voices heard on this major platform. Now, the problem with Donald Trump is he wasn't cast out because people didn't disagree with him. As my understanding is, he was cast out because he was deemed to have broken the disinformation rules on both the pandemic and on the question of his own of Joe Biden's election. In other words, he failed the disinformation tests, which is always a problem, by the way, when you're judging free speech and so on. And we might argue that disinformation should not actually, of most kinds, should not actually be subject to that kind of censorship. It's probably the right view in the end. In the end, it becomes an absurdity that the former president of the United States is per se not allowed to tweet. But the part of the problem with that is it also casts some doubt on why it is a person like that became president in the first place, but they did. So there are all kinds of problems in the mix there. Now, we're having our own big discussions about online harm. So this is the other problem that Elon Musk faces, essentially, which is even quite right-wing governments across the place, they are pretty much in favor of significant aspects of regulation or censorship on major and powerful online platforms and so on. And he's going to fall foul of that. And I do feel we bodged this conversation and this discussion hugely over the course of the last 10 years, really.
I don't think you can argue that a private organisation ought not to own Twitter, because it wouldn't have created it in the first place. And
True.
And so inevitably people are going to own and organise platforms, and then they're going to make some rules about people being on it. And my view is we slowly but surely refine those rules, and they're a bit messy, and over time they improve. And my view is the disinformation and abuse rules were good things to introduce. That Twitter has begun to introduce rules that suggest you have to read an article, or that they prompt you to read an article before you comment on it. For example, I think that's a good thing. So people do find ways about it. They screenshot
and also,
the headlines.
if you try to swear now, I'm giving something away. If you use certain words in a tweet, a thing pops up and says, "Are you sure you want to do that? Because actually it's better if you don't."
Yeah, I think all those things are good for civilizing the discussion. And what's always happened with new types of publication, we began to develop rules and laws and norms about them. So, I just think we're never going to go away, and it'll never be less than messy, because ultimately these are about proportionality. So it is a question of who the bad impact is on, whether the bad impact is serious enough to justify restricting someone else's liberty to commit that harm.
True, but the part of the problem here is the way in which governments have looked at online harms. This government has looked at online harms, for example, is to say you have a duty, a preemptive duty, to make sure that this stuff doesn't appear. Now, what that invites companies to do is to have sweeping algorithms that sweep up all kinds of things, so they don't get caught in the provisions of the law and suffer huge fines. So what you get is a really clumsy form of mega censorship, unless you're careful. And the thing is, Danny, people keep on insisting that things should be added to that censorship. They very rarely insist that things should be taken away from it. So gradually, bit by bit, you move to a situation whereby people are censored. Now, we might regard the rules that Twitter comes up at any time as good or as being bad. The problem we have is how we make a decision in democracies as to what those rules should be. And that's a really tricky business.
The other thing that struck me is we sort of have this conversation, what's happening on Twitter and Facebook and all that. While if you pick up a copy of the Times, it says, and then the Times committed to abiding by the Independent Press Standards Organisation. There's a debate about Ofcom. Ofcom regulates Times Radio in the same way it does other broadcasters. Got the BBC Trust and so on. Really, really getting knotted up in the exactly what you can and can't say at certain times of the day and all of that. While actually, far more people are on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok than are listening now. I mean, slightly more people than listening now.
Because we're developing systems that try to get the balance right, and that's very hard. We'll never, ever have got the balance completely right at any moment, but we can make improvements. Jonathan Rauch has written a very good book called The Constitution of Knowledge, and it deals with precisely the development of these kind of norms and rules. And one of the examples he gives is Wikipedia and the way that's gradually improved, and the way that it has begun to develop some sort of rules about how we can tell whether knowledge in it is true and whether it's not true. And newspapers have done the same thing. I'm always keen on saying when the Times began, one of the ways that it financed itself was by selling people the right to suppress gossip about themselves. Right. So, and it was only actually, it took a bit of time. The Times in 1785. So it was probably the 1820s before it got editors who rejected that model and who rejected also being financed by government or a major politician like Addington, and Pitt. Addington's brother was very involved in sort of putting propaganda into the paper on a virtually sort of semi-full-time basis. And once they'd done that, we got an editor called Thomas Barnes who began to move the Times towards independence. And these things develop. And what's happening with Twitter is we're going through that.
Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch are still here. Let's turn our attention now to anonymous sources. We've talked about this on the show before. But a particularly dire example of this, of the anonymous source, the Tory MP who claimed that Angela Rayner's legs distracted Boris Johnson at the dispatch box. A claim, Danny, which I felt said more about Boris Johnson than it did about Angela Rayner.
Yeah. It was just a kind of miserable story. And I feel really, it's sort of almost embarrassing to have to talk about it. I feel so badly for Angela Rayner, and indeed, actually, for women in politics. This is pretty grim, and it's a wake-up call for all men, I think, about what women face in public life. And so it's good to read it from that point of view, but I don't know what on earth anybody who was involved with that story was thinking of. I tend to concentrate, partly because I'm a Conservative peer, I think, to concentrate on the fact that there were Conservatives who were involved in a briefing of that story. And I don't, rather than on the newspaper itself, but because I want to, I think that the idea that any sort of political ally of mine would engage themselves in something as grim as that is depressing.
David, what did you make of it?
The reason why I wanted to talk about this was not that the story wasn't awful. Of course, it is awful, and Dan is quite right. It shows a kind of some attitudes which are hard dying, frankly, and actually more alive than we sometimes care to think. No, what got me was the fact that it was a story at all. If you're going to say something like that to a journalist, your name should be in the publication, attached to the thing that you have said, or the story shouldn't run. That's as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned. If you and this happens far too much, which is essentially people. And the other problem is actually we can't even be sure that this was said at all. The same journalist a few months ago ran a story about how 4 Labour MPs were considered to be thinking about defecting to join the Conservatives. It was a very unlikely story, it had to be said. And to me, it had the smack of a briefing coming out of somewhere close to some clever so-and-so near Conservative central office. But I'm sure that Danny can tell me that they don't do that kind of thing. But the point is, in both cases and in many other cases, it's simply somebody getting a story out there without their name attached to it, which you can't verify, they're not accountable for, and which then sits out there. And I think we journalists should stop doing it. I really do. I see why people do it, some kind of limited utility to it. But I think essentially it's a conspiracy both against the people who are the subject of those stories and against the public, because the journalist knows who this person is supposed to be, but no one else does, and therefore can't evaluate it. I just think it's wrong.
Well, I don't think you should run this story for certain, particularly not in. There was a case for running it as a kind of story against the people who'd made that briefing, but not a story running it effectively endorsing their perspective. But I do think I probably have a wider disagreement. I think that with David, which doesn't cover this particular story, I do think that generally you pick up a lot of information about things by people telling you things that they wouldn't necessarily say on the record, and you learn a lot. And just to give an example of that, Dominic Cummings gave a huge number of off-the-record briefings to Laura Kuenssberg, which I kind of guessed were probably from Dominic Cummings. They were completely accurate. They were more accurate, by the way, than some of the reports that about his activities, sometimes negative in newspapers that named him. They helped me understand what was going on. And if he'd had to go on the record, he quite probably wouldn't have said those things, and I would have learnt less. So I do see your point, David. It's it is sometimes a bit hard to evaluate how seriously to take it, and you've got to take into account that the newspaper.
David's got his head in his hands.
Yeah, I know. It's not an easy one. I'm not saying, David, you're definitely wrong. It's ridiculous, because you've got a good example of a story which you're right. Has all the downsides that you've always pointed out this has. But I would say, I think you're being too absolutist about it, is what I really think.
And I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? And David, is that you could have, for instance, if you had 6 cabinet ministers off the record in a story saying they opposed a plan that the Prime Minister had drawn up, then that they're not going to go on the record, because if they went on the record, they'd all have to resign. But it would be interesting to know that was happening in the cabinet. I mean, the actual point about even if the SNP in this Angela Rayner story went on the record, it's still not really a story, is it? That's the problem with the story isn't the off the recordness; it's the stupidity of the.
Hold on. It wouldn't be made on the record. That claim just wouldn't. The story wouldn't have happened, because nobody would have gone on the record to do it. And if they had gone on the record to do it, we'd have known who would have done it. It can't exist. Friends of, allies of, sources close to. It's understood that, etc. Now, every now and again, you've given, if you like, both you and Danny, quite extreme examples of where you can get a utility. Although the Dominic Cummings thing, I don't agree with it. I remember those stories coming out.
Yes.
Most of us didn't know it was from Dominic Cummings. We had no idea whether
you did not have no idea, David.
No. I didn't. No, honestly, I didn't know, Danny. And
you didn't know that the Downing Street source talking to Laura Kuenssberg was Dominic Cummings.
I didn't know that for definite. And also the thing is, he's so. Knowing that it's Dominic Cummings also tell it, because he's not an impartial bystander on that either.
It wasn't always him, by the way.
Particularly in the rows with, if you've got, there was a difference between Downing Street source Dominic Cummings and Downing Street source Lee Kane or the cabinet secretary.
But they were very informative. That's the point.
No. Hold on.
All those reports were very informative.
Firstly, Danny, the public didn't know who it was. Second, you couldn't know whether it was informative or not if you didn't know who was doing it, because the story would immediately be contradicted by another source in number 10 that said it wasn't true. And then if you tax government ministers with what the story was, they would say, well, I don't think that's true. And since you couldn't tell them, and you, by the way, they would say, you can't tell me who said that, so why should I take any notice of it? That's exactly what they did.
I think we learned quite a lot about the thinking of the people around Boris Johnson during the Dominic Cummings era, whether it be him, whether it be some of the people who were talking on his behalf, whether it be other people in that kind of Vote Leave group, through those anonymous reports. By the way, just to be clear, which I often found ridiculous, and I completely disagree with. Other times I found them interesting and right. I learnt a lot of it, and I certainly wouldn't have learnt those if they'd been forced to make those points on the record, partly because the staff can't talk on the record, which I'm actually in favour of them being allowed to do, but that's a whole separate
Annie, who are these
question.
stories for? Who are these stories for? Are they for experts like you to pass because you've got the secret info that allows you to judge them?
Yes,
or are
actually.
Hold on.
Yes, they are partly for that. So that in my column I can provide people with some sort of analysis of what they might mean. mean. That's
No,
what
they're
you
for
and
the
I do.
No, they're for the public to make a judgment about what's going on and to be informed by them.
Well, they're
And
both. They do both
They're
those
not
things.
informed by stories that come out like that. I don't
I think they are.
The band has struck up some rare disagreement. But let's end it there. It's like watching your parents fight. Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch, thanks very much for joining us for Finkelstein. You can read them.